Hello and welcome to the third episode of Woke Mental Wellness, a Black queer mental wellness podcast. I'm your host, Cassie, and today I have to give a massive trigger warning to our episode because we are going to be talking about suicide. This episode will contain discussion of suicide as well as potentially some discussion of my personal experiences. So if you're not in a place to hear that right now and to hear descriptions and discussion of suicide, then please, thank you for tuning in, but maybe skip this episode out for now and just check out the Patreon or write me a question or a prompt or something for the blog. But once again, trigger warning, content warning. This episode is about suicide. We will be talking about suicide. We'll be talking about death and dying and depression. And possibly I will be giving personal stories about suicidality. So please keep yourself safe and healthy. And here we go. So, like I said, today we're talking about suicide. Suicide's been in the news a lot lately with a lot of famous people committing suicide or being suspected of committing suicide. And so I felt like this is an episode that we needed to do pretty early on. And so here we are. Also, just about a month ago, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, released a report stating that the suicide rate in the United States has jumped more than 20%, and in some states more than 50% in about the last 2 decades. While suicide is heartbreaking, it's incredibly common. There are some reports and some studies that say over 80-90% of adults by the time they hit like 40 have thought about it at least thought about suicide at some point in their life. I bring this up because when you're feeling suicidal, if you've ever felt suicidal, it feels like you're alone. And it gets framed a lot of times as something that is rare. It's framed as something that is super outside the norm, and it's not outside the norm. That's not said as necessarily a good thing, right? But it's said as something because when you feel alone and when you feel like you're having an experience that no one else experiences, you're a lot less likely to talk about it, and you're a lot less likely to seek out help. So know that you're not alone. If you're feeling overwhelmed or suicidal, it happens. The world can be incredibly dark and overwhelming and lonely. It's not a reflection on your morality. It's not a reflection on your strength. It's not a reflection on your resilience that sometimes the majority of us have at least the passing thought of, maybe I shouldn't exist. So if you are feeling that way, this episode is designed to both help figure out, okay, so what do I do? Because it can also be really confusing, especially if you never experienced that before, to make sure that you know you're not alone. This episode's designed to help you start to learn what to do and have some ideas of what to do if somebody comes to you and discloses that they're feeling suicidal or having thoughts or what have you. And at the end, we're also going to talk a little bit about all the stuff that's been in the media and media representation of suicide and depression, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what all that is. Like I said before, there might be some personal stories or disclosure in this. And just a note, this episode is not meant to be a certified training on how to handle suicidality. This is not a end-all be-all by any means. We are all part of a community. We are all a people living in places with other people. And sometimes these things happen, and a lot of times we don't know what to do. We don't talk about these things. So this is starting a discussion. This is hopefully starting some action. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about suicidality and suicidal thoughts. Not all suicidal thoughts or actions or what have you are made equal. In mental health, there's levels that when a professional is assessing suicidality, we look at a couple of key things. We look at ideation, which is your thoughts, your ideas. We look at intent. Are you serious about them? Do you intend to do something? Do you have a plan? Do you have a concrete, I'm going to do X thing, X day, X time with whatever? If we're thinking about it like a game of Clue, right, it's going to be the butler in the dining room with the candelabra during dinner, right? Like those pieces. And then, do you have the means? Do you have the means to carry out this plan, if you have one? Those factors are what we are looking for as mental health professionals, as mental wellness professionals, when we're seeing or talking with somebody who's presenting with possible suicidality. Those assessments go more in depth, and there's some nuance to it because there is such thing as chronic suicidality as well, which I'll get into in a little bit. Let's kind of talk about this as some levels of severity. So if you're a person who is hearing this episode and you're like, but Cassie, I am constantly having thoughts about, oh, what if I just disappeared? Oh, I don't want to be here. What if that bus hit me? My family would be better off. Like those kinds of thoughts. And you're like, that's just how my life is. That might be your normal. Chronic passive suicidality is a thing. I've only really recently seen it being talked about and researched in a more public light, but you're right, it might be a thing. And it can make it really hard to get help if you keep running into people who hear, oh, I'm having these thoughts, and they immediately go to hospitalization. Not all suicidal thoughts are made equal. If we're talking about risk level, right? One, no, that's not really for lay people to decide. If you don't have mental wellness training, you might still ask that person to call their therapist or check in with a crisis line or something like that just to make sure they're safe. But also sometimes that is people's baseline. And it's important that we be able to talk about that as a possibility so that it doesn't escalate. There's a massive myth and stereotype out there that people who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. This is not true. This has been proven to not be true. I'm going to say it again. That is incorrect. Just because someone is talking about it does not mean that they're just seeking attention. It means that they're seeking help because they're feeling something. It means that they need someone to listen and might need something to go further than just listening. So we've talked a little bit about the chronic stuff, about the passive stuff. Passive suicidal thoughts are those kinds of thoughts where you're not actively thinking about doing anything, right? It's, what if I disappeared? What if I crossed the street and that car turned the corner? That's one kind of a suicidal thought or suicidal ideation. Passive isn't to say that it's not necessarily disturbing. It can absolutely be distressing. But that's just one, and that's typically considered to be a lower risk level because it relies on what some providers might refer to as a happy coincidence, right? This luck of the draw kind of circumstance. Then we've got active thoughts, which are more along the lines of, what if I blank? You can fill in the blank. I'm sure I don't have to spell it out for you, what someone might do in order to end their life. Those thoughts are part of a higher risk profile because that's something that's within your own grasp. So that's the ideation piece. If we start talking about like intent, we have all kinds of thoughts day to day that we would never, ever do. I mean, if you drive, how many times has some jerk cut you off and you've thought, oh my God, that motherfucker, I'm gonna blah, 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 blah. You're not actually going to do that laundry list of expletives that just came out of your mouth or that just flowed through your brain. The same can be true of suicidal thoughts. So intent. Is this something that you actually might do? Are you having these thoughts and you might actually act on them? This can be compounded by if you're experiencing voices or delusions or other aspects of psychosis that can complicate your free will in some ways. But intent, do you have that? If we have active thoughts and intent, we're really starting to get up there as far as severity. And probably also in the distress that you're feeling if you're having this thought, if you're experiencing these symptoms. And then a plan. So maybe you're having the thought, I don't want to be alive anymore. And maybe you have a little bit of intent to do something about it. Do you have a plan? We're looking for things that might signal a plan, being like, oh, I'll just go here at this time and end it. Even really vague things can count as plans. And we can go into some signs and stuff in a minute. But thoughts, intent, plans, means. Do you have what it takes to enact the plan? There's a big difference between I'm going to do this thing with a flamethrower, right? Because most of us don't have flamethrowers, versus I'm going to do this thing with the CTA train. Because all you have to do then is have a bus card. Having all of those things puts the risk really high. And once you start getting a plan, this might be a situation in which we really need to start looking at hospitalizing. Going into the hospital and making sure that you're safe. There's all kinds of checklists and crisis lines and suicide hotlines as well that you can look up and that I'll put in the description. So when we get to that sort of a level, we want to really look at hospitalizing or going into the hospital, and there's all kinds of hotlines and crisis lines and things that you can call, and I'll make sure that I put them in the description and the comments and everything on YouTube and Patreon and Facebook and Twitter to make sure that they're readily accessible. I'll include all of the queer-specific lines as well to make sure that we're getting validating care. But going back just a little bit before we get into this piece about what to do if you or someone you know is feeling suicidal or having distressing suicidal thoughts. Let's go back a little bit to some signs. So I laid out the kind of severity whale that we look at as providers, but also just general signs that really anybody can maybe note. So the ones that everybody really talks about is if someone is feeling depressed. If you notice someone's depressed, that's low mood, low motivation, somebody who maybe you're not getting out of bed anymore. Maybe you don't have that motivation to cook anymore. Maybe showering feels like a really heavy burden. Those sorts of things can be depression. Maybe you're a little overly focused on certain things to the exclusion of other things. That might be also a little bit of a possible warning flag. We talk about those a lot. Some other signs that you want to be really careful is if somebody is fitting those kinds of descriptions and then they get real happy all of a sudden. That might mean they've started to finalize a plan. A stark uptick in mood in somebody who was depressed or feeling suicidal can be dangerous. Giving away of things that were important to them that's something to watch out for as well, because the idea behind that is, oh, I won't need it anymore, right? I won't need it anymore, I'm going to be dead. So if you notice that in yourself and you're starting to think about, okay, well, 4 days ago I was super down and everything, and then you think through, okay, well, this is how I'll do this. Okay, so Aunt Cindy gets the crock pot, Jimmy gets the cat, you know what, Lula really likes my bird, she can have it. Watch out. That's a lot. And it can absolutely feel like a weight has been lifted. And so you'll see that uptick in mood, or you might notice it in yourself if you get to that stage. So if you notice that, just really pay attention, whether it's yourself or whether it's, somebody who's coming to you and offering you something that you know they really like. It can be a hard place to be in. So watch out for those sorts of signs. People talking about doing really reckless things and not caring. Now, this one's a little harder, especially if you're like me and you're a millennial, because you might have noticed by posts and articles that have come out, we as a generation are really big on dark humor. That does include a lot of discussion of suicidality and mentioning of killing oneself, because the world is looking pretty sketchy and it can be really hard to deal with sometimes. And it can be relieving to express yourself, which is fine. But it's just a thing worth noting that continuous kind of joking might be something to look out for, especially if you're noticing some of the other signs and stuff that we talked about before. Jokes alone, probably not enough. I know I myself have a really dark sense of humor too. So it's really worth noting so that it's out there. But also know that that one thing alone really isn't enough to stage an intervention and what have you. And really, I would not suggest staging an intervention. That's really jarring and might make people feel attacked. But yeah, once again, this is not meant to be solid, sound mental health advice. This is meant to be a discussion and meant to be some hey, look out for these things. Get yourself educated more kind of an episode. So we've already kind of started going into this briefly as we've talked about signs and symptoms and severity and stuff. But what do you do? What do you do when you start experiencing this or when someone else starts experiencing this? What happens next? There's a lot of things that you can do. There are, like I said at the beginning of the episode, the majority of adults have at least one point in their life thought about suicide. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean you'll do it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to check yourself into the hospital immediately. You're gonna want to, if it's very distressing and you notice that you're starting to have these thoughts, they're bothering you, you might want to talk to somebody. Then that's going to be the time where you start looking for someone to see. That might be the time where you call your local hotline or you call one of the national suicide crisis lines and talk to someone. Whether it's a one-time thing or whether it's the beginning of a more longer-term treatment to keep yourself safe. Whatever works for you is what works for you. If you notice that you're checking a lot of the boxes on the really high-risk stuff that I was talking about, the means and the intent and the plan, then it might be time to check yourself into a hospital. This can be complicated because hospitals can be really scary places, especially if you are Black and particularly if you're queer. Hospitals don't have the best reputation, and I'm not going to lie about that because it's part of going in knowledgeable. So if you notice that you're someone who's prone to depression or who has suicidal thoughts semi-regularly, or occasionally you notice one time of the year is really rough for you, and so maybe you develop a little bit of a wellness plan. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do that, but part of that might be, which hospital do you want to be taken to or do you want to go to? And if you do this, before it gets to the point where you have to call 911 or have to be taken in involuntarily, which is a really, really last resort sort of a thing, the involuntary. You can look up which hospitals in your area are the best for queer people. And some areas might even have specific lists for queer people of color. But which hospitals do best with gendering people properly when they're on the ward? And the Human Rights Campaign has a list. Hospitals have to decide whether they're in it, and it's largely self-report. But there's Facebook groups and all kinds of things that you can post in your city or your area or your state and just be like, hey, has anyone had any experiences with this particular hospital? Does anyone know which hospitals are best with trans women? Does anyone know which hospitals do best with queer people whose parents don't know? Know what your options are ahead of time if possible. Even if you've never experienced suicidality or thoughts or anything, it might be good to just kind of look at that. Because suicide's not the only thing we go to the hospital for. Just keep yourself aware of who's good at what. So you can call hotlines. You can seek out providers for weekly therapy. You can do inpatient, which is hospitalization. There's also different programs, PHP, partial hospitalization programs, that are available in some places. Not all hospitals have them, not all insurances will cover them, but that might be an option. They're shorter term but high intensity, so it's like 5 days a week. You go for the majority of the day. And you do group therapy, individual therapy. Some of them have psychiatric, so like medication services available, all one-stop shop. And then as you start to graduate from the program, they help you set up for regular weekly or bi-weekly services to kind of step you down. There's also IOP, that's intensive outpatient programs that are a step down from partial hospitalization. So it would be inpatient, PHP, IOP is the levels stepping down or going down. That might help to increase the amount of services that you're getting without necessarily having to go inpatient. If your resources allow for that, be it insurance, money, location, whether they're available, whether they cater to your specific situation. Because some IOPs and PHPs are gender specific, they might be eating disorder specific or illness specific, they might be substance use, dual diagnosis specific. So that's just something good to know about, and you'd have to talk with your doctors and kind of do some research on that as well. The biggest thing here is if you're feeling suicidal, talk to someone. That can be hard because feeling suicidal, feeling like you want to die, can be incredibly isolating. I know, at least for me, it can come from a place of feeling alone already, from feeling like people don't care about me or they're better off without me. So it's hard to then say, oh, these people that I don't think give a damn about me, let me go talk to one of them. That's incredibly difficult. Not everyone can do that. I've had where I've told friends and chosen family warning signs to check in with me. I'm going to bring up the hotlines again. Not all of them are great. A lot of times they're short-staffed and underfunded, but they really are a resource that can really help people, and we should help people to use them. Sometimes people really do lack the support of people that are around them, especially when we're talking about adding queerness onto suicidality. We can't discount that either. LGBTQIA plus people have some of the highest suicide rates of any demographic. You add being Black on top of that and it really skyrockets, particularly with the trans community. So from that point, sometimes the people around them aren't safe. Sometimes the people around us really aren't safe to talk to. And so finding anyone you can talk to, whether it's a stranger on the hotline, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a teacher, professor, doctor, just someone that you can talk with to say, hey, I'm really feeling unsafe. someone that's going to be able to take that and hold that for you, with you, and be like, okay, so that sounds really scary. Like, can you tell me more? What are we going to, like, what do you want to do about that? Do you feel like we need to do something more? Do you feel like we need to go to the hospital? What can keep you safe is really important. And when we're talking about what to do, it's really easy to get bogged down in fault or blame or, oh, just reach out. Well, part of depression, part of feeling suicidal is that, like, the nature of what your brain is doing means that you're not really wanting to reach out and you don't feel like that's possible. Part of being not in that person's brain as a friend or a caregiver, whoever you are to that person, means that you can't read their mind. Suicide is really no one's fault. This isn't a place where we place fault or blame. It can feel that way, especially if we've had friends and family members and loved ones who have committed suicide. It feels shitty to be left behind. And that's understandable, and it's part of the grieving process. But also, from the outside, whether it's the media, whether it's other friends or family, like, blaming someone for someone else's suicide is not okay. I can pretty well guarantee you that whoever you're blaming already feels horrible. I can guarantee you they're already going through an awful situation and they do not need you being a jerk and an asshole. We want to help prevent suicide in ourselves and other people. That's what we're here for. But sometimes it just doesn't happen. And sometimes it's just part of life and there's nothing more that we could have done. There's nothing that we could do. That's a really hard thing for most people to sit with, whether you're trained or not. A lot of providers, a lot of therapists and professionals, having a client commit suicide is in itself a traumatic experience, and we will blame ourselves. Many of us will blame ourselves. Oh, isn't there something that we could do? What did we miss? How did this happen? All of these questions. It's not just friends or family, right? Like, when someone's involved in services, it's everyone, because it's human, because we wanted to help and we're feeling bad and we're trying to place blame, and that's an internal thing that we do to ourselves, and no one deserves and no one is to blame unless it's one of those incredible, horrible outlier situations, right? But by and large, these thoughts and these feelings don't need to be externalized. People who have experienced someone they care about killing themselves don't need to be asked, well, what did you do? How could you have helped? Why did this happen? They don't need that. So what do you do? What do we do? Besides, if someone comes to you to the best of your ability with as many spoons as you have for the situation, helping them out to do what they want to do, as far as linkage to services, having a friend's night to try and help out if you have the ability to do something like that. Beyond that, there's not something else to do. Suicide's deeply personal. It comes from somewhere where you're in a lot of pain and distress, and we don't need to place blame on that anywhere. It's easy to get bogged down on that, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the media representation part. But as far as what to do, just do what you can do. We're not all suicide crisis counselors. We're not all trained, and we're not all going to have the ability to fulfill that role. We're not all going to be able to be on suicide watch for our friends. And that is okay. It is okay to draw your own boundaries. I know I have had situations where I was feeling unsafe myself, and I had a friend call me and be like, hey, I'm feeling really down and really unsafe. Can you help me? And I had to tell them no. And it was hard, and I felt shitty. But it was the right thing to do because we would have bounced off of each other in a really unhealthy sort of way. So do what you can, but also know your limits. Don't just keep pushing because that fear of blame and guilt is creeping in. If you're not in a good place, and I've said it before, if you're not in a good place, the likelihood of being able to provide that level and steward that level of hurt and pain, it's not good. So do what you can and know your limits. Now that we've talked a bit about what to do, and I've already started lapsing into this piece about media representation and the way it's portrayed and the way that we talk about suicide in the media, I want to really start naming this and talking about common beliefs and popular stereotypes that get propagated both through news and through TV shows. Looking at you, 13 Reasons Why. Yeah, that show. No. No. But anyway, so when we talk about suicide, I already mentioned this blame game shit that happens where the people close to that person are already blaming themselves more than likely because they were close to that person and because as a society, we really suck at dealing with death, period, let alone death that we don't see as should have had happening. Part of that comes from this attitude in our society of we have to stop it. Sometimes this is probably going to be a really unpopular opinion, and I'm going to own that. But sometimes there is not anything that we can do. Sometimes we do everything that we're supposed to do. We play it by the book. We go above the book. We write an entirely new book, and the suicide still happens. The person still kills themselves. It happens. It feels shitty for those of us that are left behind, but it happens. Sometimes it is not preventable, whether that is a case of someone has a chronic terminal illness that is painful as hell and they're finding the only relief that they can, or if it's a mental illness that was just overwhelming. This attitude feeds into the blame of the people closest to the person who committed suicide. And it has to stop because it really affects the health and wellness of those people and their ability to grieve and to process. It's been mentioned before, but also the glorification of suicide as the ultimate revenge, or this glamorous ending, can also be problematic. It can fuel suicide where it maybe wouldn't have happened before. We have to walk a line that I don't think as a society we've figured out where that line is, that line between freedom of choice and the honoring or caring about human life. I don't think we found that place, but I think the way that suicide gets shown, it either gets shown as being this selfish act where I'm sure most of you have heard this, the how could you be so selfish? Well, think about the people around you is not a good line. That kind of blame can make things so much worse. And it can make the person less likely to talk to anyone because then they'll feel more like a burden. So please don't do that. The media does that a lot. The suicide prevention PSA kind of things, they're getting a little better, but it was a really popular line for a really long time. And especially, obviously, groups are not homogenous, but as Black people, we tend to be a little more communal, and with Latinx cultures and stuff, that line can get used a lot. Like, what would your mother think? Sort of things. That blaming, shaming game is seldom a good thing long term. In the moment, in that immediate moment, it might get the person to shut up, which isn't what we want to happen. Where we as a society and the media fails us is that this is something we should be able to talk about. This episode has been incredibly heavy. It has been longer than I thought it would be. And it's rough. If you're still here, thank you. But also, this is something that we should be able to talk about pretty openly. It's heavy and it's rough, and it's not talking about like the cute kitten video on YouTube, but it's important. And part of this blame and shame and those sorts of things that we do, even sometimes the glorification, comes out of this discomfort around death, particularly around somebody choosing death. Whether that's a legitimate choice or not is something that, as a society, we're still debating. And what death means is highly personal, the same way that this topic is to the vast majority of people. But just like in a lot of ways we make the personal political and public in order to raise awareness, the same needs to happen. The same hopefully is going to continue to happen with suicide, because like I said at the beginning, these rates, they're rising. People are sad and feel hopeless, and whether we can change that or not, we can try. And we can try in a really non-judgmental way that validates the outcome, whether someone feels that this really is their only choice and nothing is going to get better and this is the only way, which is the way that some people who complete suicide feel. And that sucks, but I'm also not going to judge them. Or if it's a point in time that is really rough for a person and they get some extra help and change a few things up and it makes the difference and they're able to keep going, that's also valid. We don't like seeing people killing themselves. Like, that's not the aim. But we have to be open in our discussions about that possibility in order for people to feel comfortable and safe talking about it, in order for that prevention to work. Involuntary hospitalization is part of my job. Sometimes. That's where I fill out documents that force someone into the hospital because they're a danger to themselves or others. This can be very traumatic. And in shows like Law and Order or other crime type shows or hospital type shows, it gets really glossed over what a big deal something like that can be to somebody. The media also, I keep saying media like it's this big nebulous thing. TV shows that we watch, things that we listen to, all of these things, when they tackle suicide, sometimes they don't do it in a good way. They overlook the ways in which a hospital can be traumatizing to somebody who's trans and keeps getting called by the pronouns of the sex that they were assigned at birth. Like, that in itself can be a trigger. That in itself isn't healing. When we talk about suicide in the case of the queer community and trans people, that constant rejection that happens, seeing on the news about the latest Supreme Court decision, or court decision period, maybe not Supreme Court, where somebody has decided that trans women aren't women. Looking at you, Planet Fitness appeal decision. Those sorts of things can be triggering, and when we talk about triggering, that could include triggering suicidality. So please, when you're looking at shows, looking at news, remember that. maybe check in on your friends if you have the spoons. Post up, ask chosen family, friends, bio family, whatever, to check on you so that we can have these conversations. So that more people can be better and can be well and can reach a level of mental wellness that doesn't include suicide. So that we can have conversations where people who experience chronic suicidality, chronic passive suicidality, and that's their norm, don't have to be afraid to talk to people about it for fear of being hospitalized when it's really unnecessary and they just need an ear because maybe it's a little more intense that day or that week. This is something that affects the vast majority of us, and we have to be able to talk about. So, I'm going to stop there because this has been a long and very, very heavy episode. So, if you've finished this episode, thank you. And if you skipped around and stuff, still thank you. If you turned it off and you're just listening to the end because you wanted to hear maybe what the next episode is if I had it planned, also thank you no matter what. And please share this episode, share the links that will be in the comments and the blog and on Twitter and everywhere, Patreon, so that we can talk about this more and so that people know that they're not alone. I experience suicidality. I have in the past. I frequently have chronic passive suicidal thoughts. You are not alone. I hope everyone is safe and has what they need to be well. Thank you for listening to Woke Mental Wellness, a Black queer mental wellness podcast about us, by us, and for us.